Last time we saw Alexander the Great awoke in the New World, the lands of Essos and Westeros. With cunning strategy and the iron discipline of his phalanx, he crushed the armies of Braavos and claimed the city as his new capital. Naming it New Pella, Alexander laid the foundation of his new kingdom, determined to extend his rule beyond the Narrow Sea. But victories come at a cost. Hundreds of Macedonians had fallen to the devastating arrows of the Braavosi, and Alexander knew that to march on Westeros, he would need new strength and new allies. And now, as his generals prepared the fleet and his soldiers sharpened their spears, news arrives that will change the course of his conquest forever. The Dothraki have arrived, and with them, the new chapter in Alexander's conquest begins. Alexander sat in the great hall of New Pella, weighed down not by battle, but by the endless demands of kingship. His generals Craterus and Hephaestion placed paper after paper before him, decrees to sign, orders to approve, disputes to settle. Though he endured it with the discipline of a soldier, Alexander had never loved such duties. Yet he worked tirelessly, determined to bring stability and prosperity to his newly conquered lands. Just then, the doors of the great hall swung open. It was Ptolemy, his face alight with triumph. The Dothraki had arrived. Ptolemy had returned with 100 of the fiercest fighters the Dothraki had to offer. The horsemen whose skill in battle was famed across the world created quite the stir among the people of New Pella, for never before had they seen these nomads this close to the Narrow Sea. Alexander, delighted, wasted no time. He entrusted them to his loyal companion Craterus, and ordered them to be trained in the Macedonian way of war. Alexander believed that with Macedonian discipline, these riders would become an unstoppable force. From New Pella, Alexander gave his orders. The great fleet, built in haste over the past weeks, was ready for war. Men were called to muster, supplies gathered, and the street of the city filled with the clamor of preparation. The harbor that had once belonged to Braavos was now teemed with ships under Macedonian banners, their sails waiting for the winds that would carry them west. After weeks of planning, training men, and gathering resources, the Macedonian machine was finally ready to move. The fleet set sail westward, carrying the king and his army towards Westeros. The fleet made landfall near the village of New Keep, only a few miles east of Longbow Hall, a stronghold of the Vale. Determined to bring his enemies to him before his army could lose its edge, Alexander struck swiftly. Villages along the coast were put to the torch, their wealth seized, and the people scattered. These raids sent ripples of fear across the Vale, but the lords of the Vale were not fools. Word of Alexander's victory at Samotha had reached their ears, and they had no desire to meet him in open battle. So instead of marching out, the Valemen retreated behind the safe walls of the Eyrie, confident that no army would be able to pry them from the high walls of the Eyrie. For Alexander, this presented a grim choice. He knew his numbers were limited. Only so many men had crossed the sea with him. To waste half his army storming castles would only leave him weakened and vulnerable, ripe for destruction should the full might of the Vale gather against him. Yet to linger and do nothing was just as dangerous. Alexander, bold as ever, weighed the risks. He had faced greater odds before and triumphed. To hesitate now would be to invite ruin, and so he made his choice. The king of Macedonia ordered his army forward, laying siege to the stronghold of Longbow Hall. Longbow Hall, though a modest castle compared to the Eyrie, was well defended and well supplied. Alexander's scouts confirmed what he already suspected. To starve out the garrison would take not weeks, but months, perhaps even years. He might have chosen that patient course. But Alexander, always hungry for glory, refused to be known as a conqueror who spent years grinding down a single fortress. So he gave his order: attack. Whether it was vanity that guided his hand, or a cold calculation that spending years in a foreign land grinding down a single fortress was just as dangerous, we cannot know. But we do know this: the siege of Longbow Hall had begun. Alexander's army closed in on the walls of Longbow Hall. 2 siege towers and a great battering ram creeped forward, pushed by men grim and determined. From the walls, the defenders looked down, unsettled by the sight. But then, Alexander saw it. Mounted on the battlements were not 2, but 4 siege engines. He knew at once the danger. At the siege of Braavos, half as many had blown big holes in his army. What havoc, then, would these unleash? But before he could think further, the first stone flew. It crashed down with terrifying force, crushing men by the dozens. Each shot followed, killing 20-30 soldiers at once. The sounds of agony and terrifying explosions filled the air. The advance became a slaughter, but Alexander knew it was too late to turn back. He gave the order, attack at the double. The pace quickened, and men threw themselves at the towers and the battering ram, desperate to reach the walls before they were annihilated. Still, casualties mounted, littering the field with broken bodies. At last, the towers hit the battlements, and the ram thundered against the gates. The Macedonians, terrified and angry by what they had endured, fought like demons unleashed. The defenders were quickly overwhelmed, cut down without mercy, and slowly, the rage of the invaders spilled over into barbarity. Longbow Hall had now become a place of horror. Men were crucified, and not even women and children were spared. Alexander had successfully taken the castle, but it did not feel like victory. For Alexander himself, the cost weighed heavily. He had won a stronghold, but at the price of over 400 Macedonians, and perhaps something greater, the hearts of the people he sought to rule. The mood in the camp was grim. It was said that the gods had punished them for the atrocities they had committed during the siege. But even worse news soon followed. Word of the massacre that had taken place at Longbow Hall spread across Westeros like wildfire. The lords of the north and the rulers of the Riverlands, outraged by the Macedonian brutality, declared war. What had begun as a campaign of conquest had now become a struggle for survival. Outnumbered and isolated, Alexander faced a grim reality. If the armies of the Vale, the north, and the Riverlands joined together, his smaller force would be crushed between them. Yet, where others saw defeat, Alexander saw opportunity. He turned his mind to strategy. From scout reports, Alexander knew that the Lord of the Vale, young Robb Stark, was proud, eager to show his worth in battle, and easily manipulated. So Alexander sent envoys to the area, bearing words of false humility. He claimed his army had been broken, and that he sought peace. The bait worked. Driven by the promise of glory, the young Aaron mustered his banners, and marched out to meet Alexander, before the northern and the Riverlands host could arrive. Alexander had managed to draw his enemy out exactly as planned. The two armies met on the fields below Longbow Hall. The army of the Vale approached the battlefield with their head held high, confident they were walking towards inevitable glory. Yet as they approached, they saw the Macedonian army already arrayed in perfect battle formation. Alexander had chosen the place of the battle himself, a narrow plain with mountains to the left and the sea to the right. The plain was so narrow, in fact, that the young Lord Robb Stark could not even fit all his cavalry in a single line, greatly diminishing their numerical advantage, forcing them to meet the famed Dothraki and companion cavalry man to man. On the left, Parmenion commanded the Thessalian and Dothraki cavalry. In the center, commanded by Ptolemy and Craterus respectively, stood the Macedonian phalanx. And on the right, Alexander himself commanded the famed companion cavalry, along with Hephaestion. On the other side of the field, the famed Vale cavalry stood fierce and ready, their shiny plate armor glistening in the sun. The young Lord Robb had placed himself directly across Alexander on the right, bravely or stupidly deciding to meet the Macedonian invader face to face, and win this glorious victory for his house. Alexander rode down the length of his battle line, talking to his highest generals and to the loneliest footmen alike by name. He told them how much better in the art of war they were, and that this foe was nothing compared to what they had already vanquished. The young Lord of the Vale, confident in his numbers and eager to win the day, began the battle. Trumpets sounded across the field, and with the thunder of hoofs, the Vale cavalry on both flanks surged forward. Alexander saw the movement instantly, and quickly ordered both his cavalry flanks to ride out and meet them. Alexander and the companion cavalry hit first, and quickly, the sounds of steel clashing and bones breaking filled the air. On both flanks, the battle for dominance had begun. With all the cavalry engaged, Alexander gave his next command. The Macedonian phalanx, flanked by the elite Hypaspists, moved forward to engage the enemy. And with a shattering crash, the battle was joined in the center. Spears were thrust, shields were broken, and the sounds of agony filled the air. Across the whole field, hand-to-hand combat surged for hours, and the battle hung in the balance. But then, cracks began to form. On the left flank, Parmenian's forces were beginning to be pushed back. Heavily outnumbered and fighting the full-plated Vale Knights, cracks in the Dothraki and Thessalian cavalry were beginning to show. Around the same time, cracks were beginning to show in the Macedonian center. Robb and Aaron had deliberately placed his best units on the left flank, facing the Macedonian hypaspists, and avoiding the famed Macedonian phalanx entirely. And with heavier armor and longer spears, they slowly started to get the better of their Macedonian counterparts. Alexander was informed about the trouble on his left, and knew the battle hung by a thread. Thinking fast, Alexander ordered his entire cavalry to disengage, making it look like they were retreating. To the untrained eye, it looked like the Macedonians had lost their will to fight, and the young Lord of the Vale saw an opportunity. He ordered his entire flank to pursue the fleeing Macedonians. And just then, on Alexander's orders, the cavalry turned around and smashed back into the fray. In the chaos, the Lord Robb and Aaron was killed. Leaderless and shocked, the remaining cavalry decided to flee the battlefield after a short fight. With the enemy's right flank shattered, Alexander wasted no time. Gathering his cavalry around him, he quickly surged across the field, hitting the Vale army in the rear, precisely where his army was faltering the most. Macedonian cavalry lances surged through the back of the disorganized line, cutting down men already locked in desperate combat. This removed a lot of pressure on the Macedonian center. The line steadied, and a roar of triumph swept across the battlefield. With their lord dead and their army surrounded, the will of the Vale broke. Some threw down their arms and fled, while others were killed where they stood. The once proud knights of the Vale were no more, and the field now belonged to Alexander. The battle had been bloody for both sides. Alexander lost a modest 100 men, but the Vale had paid a far greater price. Over 600 of their finest warriors lay dead on the ground. Alexander had won the battle, but there was little time for celebration. Though the Vale had been routed, the victory had come at a bitter cost. Alexander now commanded barely 600 men fit for battle. 600, alone in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, and with no hope of reinforcements across the sea. And worse still, scouts soon returned with grim news. The banners of the north and the Riverlands had been spotted on the horizon. A great host marching south under the young wolf, Robb Stark, already hardened by war and united by vengeance. The greatest test of his conquest was about to begin. The encounter was near.